Okay, we're good to go, Dave.
Okay. So if you look at that first page, it's called Design Synthesis. And if you're going to left to right, it kind of walks you through the different principles that are involved in landscape design or any type of design. So the first bubble to your left, it says primary design elements, which are line, form, and mass. And then below that's the secondary design elements, texture and color. And then to the right of that, you have design tools, and to the right of that, you have design principles. When you're first starting to do your landscape design work, this is a good just kind of a checklist to kind of go through when you're starting to put together a landscape design, just to kind of remind you the different things that are involved in landscape design. So at the second page, we're going to go into the primary elements. The first element is line. So it's the basic element framework that defines space. You know, a composition may contain horizontal or vertical lines. Lines that are moving toward and away from the viewer, to the left or to the right. Some are parallel, whereas others intersect, all defining and enhancing the dimensionality of space. The line can be real or implied as in nature. It can control the visual and physical elements through space. So this is really one of the primary design elements is line. And so in that first line drawing, you'll see that spreading plant forms can carry horizontal lines of the building on the site. So you can see that this house has some pretty strong horizontal lines. And so when you're doing a landscape, you want to kind of accentuate or whatever lines or element. It may be like in this lines, you can see the lines of the roof line is very, very strong. So you're kind of continuing that in the landscape design. So those are kind of just a brief description of line. The next primary design element is form. So two-dimensional are bounded by perimeter lines, whereas fixed or implied. Form can be harmonious or discordant. Harsh contrast and mixing numerous forms is discordant. Form is equivalent to personality. So you don't want a bunch of harsh forms that distract or clash with each other. So there's different types of plant forms. So if you kind of go through this, there's a cone form, and if you kind of look down into the next line drawing, it's similar to the pyramidal or columnar lines there. And so that adds weight. So you have the list of plant forms, and below that you have a different kind of line drawing of the different shapes of plants. So on the lower left-hand side, you have pyramidal, and on that same line, you have columnar. So those would be kind of your cone shapes. Okay. And so they add weight or stability to the landscape. So it kind of ties it down. If you want to use a political phrase from the Bush years, gravitas. It adds gravitas to the landscape. So globes, they contrast well with spikes or fountains. So globes are round. If you look down below on the bottom line, there's round. And then to the very right-hand corner is a kind of a vase shape, which is similar to spikes or fountains. So those two shapes work well together. And the fountains add grace and elegance. Usually, if you're talking fountains, you're talking like an ornamental grass or possibly New Zealand flax or something like that. So that's kind of add grace and elegance to the landscape. And then mats, which is a ground cover, where if you look at the top, there's prostrate or mound or spreading. Those are plant shapes that you use to kind of tie the landscape together. And we'll get into this more as we go in through the different design elements. Mounds carry weight but are softer than globes. So the mound is like a globe, but it's not as high. And spikes direct the eye skyward. So, think of like Italian cypress or something like that, or arborvitae that's planted by itself. That would be kind of a spike. So you can kind of use that to tie things together. If you're in a really small space and it's really tight and you want to make that space feel better, you can use kind of spikes to kind of direct the eye upwards as well as throughout the space. Any questions on those?
That makes sense.
Okay, and like I said, as we go through this, it'll kind of tie everything together. So I know kind of standalone, these may not make a lot of sense, but as we go through it, it'll start tying everything together.
So the spike, I did get a little lost on the spikes part. The spikes would be pyramidal and columnar.
Spikes, yeah, it would be more the columnar. Okay, yeah. So like that one job you guys are working with has a lot of Italian cypress. That would be a spike.
Okay. And then foundation, is that foundation? That would be
fountain. That's like ornamental grasses.
Is that like that down on the bottom there?
What's that now? It would
like the bat, like
it would be like a vase shape. So to the right hand corner, just to the right of that tree, see that shape there? That would be a fountain. Okay. And then the third primary design element is mass, and it's solid three-dimensional forms in opposition to space. Although plants are not necessarily solid forms, they represent visual mass. So usually mass is going to be like a landscape boulder, or it's mostly going to be landscape boulders or conifer plants. They're pretty solid. They're going to be considered mass. Okay. Okay, so now we're into the secondary design elements. So the first one's texture, and I've got quite a bit here on texture, and we'll kind of go through that pretty in depth. Texture, the character of the surface of a form or group of forms. Scale directly relates to texture in that it determines the degree of detail that is easily perceptible and noticeable to the human eye. So as you go through the next line drawing, there's coarse texture, and it could be plants that have big leaves, or it could be when the plant's deciduous, it has more kind of substantial branches. And then you go down from there to medium texture, the same way, medium-sized leaves, medium-sized branches, and then fine texture, smaller leaves and smaller size branches if you're dealing with a deciduous shrub. So we'll get into why texture is important as far as a design element. And it's one of the tools that you can use to make a small space feel bigger. And so if you go to the next line drawing, coarse textured plants material move towards the viewer while fine textured ones move away. So the next one, you see a plant in the corner. The use of a coarse texture in small spaces decreases the apparent size of the area, and it appears harsh. So if you were going to have a real small backyard like most of these are, you'd want the finer textured plants to be in the distance and the coarser textured plants in the foreground, closer to like the patio or stuff. So that the eye thinks that, you know, the size of the leaves are all kind of the same. So it's going to say that say if you have a plant with bigger leaves next to you at the patio, or if you're looking out the kitchen window and you have one that kind of frames the window with a larger sized leaf, and then out in the distance in the corner or something you have plants with smaller leaves, your eye is going to think that plant is farther away because its leaves are smaller than the ones that are closer to you. Does that make sense?
Say that one more time.
Okay. So if you have a...
You want a closer, you want a smaller plant that's closer to you because it's going to give you
No, you want the plant with the bigger leaves closer to you.
Oh, okay. Bigger leaves. Okay.
And then you want the plant with the smaller leaves farther away.
Okay.
So the eye's point of reference is the plant that's closest to you with the bigger leaves. And it's going to think that it's going to kind of perceive that the plant with the smaller leaves, it's the same size leaf on it, and it's going to make that eye think that should be farther away and create that sense of distance.
Okay.
That makes sense?
Yep.
Okay. So, and that next line drawing is this: if you're working in a real small space and I know, Will, we had someone that wanted to make their backyard feel bigger because it was really small. This is how one of the design elements you would use to make it feel bigger than what it actually is. So then that next one, if you look at it, you use the plants with the bigger leaves or the coarse leaves closer to you, and then you grade down to the medium-sized leaves on either side, and then in the far distance you'd have the finer textured leaves in the corner. So for an attractive border mass that forms a corner planting, start with the coarsest texture for the end plantings, and then grade into the medium and then the fine at the center. This gives the composition depth, making it appear larger than it actually is. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, on to the next page. So you can develop interesting compositions by grading from the coarsest texture to the finest. For a group or linear planting, a stair-step sequence, top left, is often effective. This sequence requires decreasing the height and increasing the numbers of plants used as you move down from the coarse texture. A possible arrangement of these plants is shown in this bottom, the bottom bird's eye viewing of the landscape. So in this one, you have the bigger plants have the coarse texture, the medium-sized plants have the medium texture, and the small plants have the fine texture. Okay? Okay, so this photo that has the hydrangea in the middle is just an example of everything's green in this photo, right? But yet because the plants have different textures, they're able to stand out a little bit and just not look like just a green mass of just all one color. So this is an example of where you're using similar colors, but it's the texture of the plants that help differentiate themselves from each other. Okay? Okay. And then the following two pictures, you've got, remember they said the spikes work well with mounds or globes? So this is an example of that, where you have the hosta that has the bigger leaves on it, and then you have the spiky plants, which look like a kind of a variegated, I guess it's a phormium of some type. So see how they different. The two shapes or the forms of the leaves separate each other.
Yeah, I see that in the photo, but I don't know. Is it maybe I just need to hear more to understand it better?
Yeah. Okay. And again, the photo below it is a really large leafed rhododendron. Again, everything's green in there. It's kind of, different shades of green, but because of the larger texture of the leaves, and the larger size of the leaves, it stands out against the green background.
That makes sense.
Okay. So the next secondary design element is color. Okay, and there's quite a bit of information here on color, and we'll go through it. Hopefully you kind of get just an overview of color. It's important, but not as important as some of the other design elements. But we'll kind of go through this and how we can use it to how it relates to the landscape design. So color is a reflection of light in the landscape. Controlled use of color brings harmony and balance into a chaotic landscape. And among the generally quiet weathered greens, browns, and grays, I'm not going to go through this whole thing on that. You guys can read that on your own. But we'll get into just the different things. So the first line drawing, medium tone greens should act as a transition between dark and light greens. So as you look at this, you've got a dark green color, the two cone-shaped plants. And then you have a light green colored is the kind of the globe-shaped plant on the right. Okay, so they're using the medium tone green to tie those two colors together. Okay, you got that? Okay. And then dark foliage plants move toward the viewer, and light foliage plants move away from the viewer. So in this case, if we're trying to create a sense of the space feeling larger, you have the darker colored plant closer to you and the lighter colored plant out into the landscape to create that illusion of space. Okay. So the next page, you have the color wheel. Okay. And so there are three primary colors. If you look at there's red, blue, and yellow. Okay, those are your primary colors, and they work well together. They accentuate each other. And that's one probably, as far as color, those are probably the primary colors I always try to use in a landscape. Blue, I'm usually getting from like a Colorado blue spruce or a globe spruce or star juniper. That's probably my go-to blue because there's not a lot of blues in nature, and there's not a lot of blues as far as plants. Yellow can be kind of my go-to on that. Probably there's several. One would be Kaleidoscopibulia. Another one would be there's kind of a green and gold euonymus called name's escaping me right now. And red is usually kind of Nandinas. That's kind of what I usually use as far as a red color. So those are kind of some different colors you can use together. The picture below that's a good example of primary colors that are together. This happens to be in the fall. So you can see there's a grouping of Colorado blue spruce there. There's some burning bush to the left of those, and there's kind of a orange yellow. That's a type of Japanese maple that's a fall color on it. So that's just an example of a planting where they've used primary colors. Okay, and so warm and cool colors. So warm colors are going to be your red to yellow to red. Those colors advance, so you can use those kind of farther in the landscape. They're more noticeable farther away. So the cool colors are green to violet, and they recede. So those, if you're using blue or violet in your landscape, you want that closer in where you can notice it. You don't want blues unless it's like a blue spruce or something that has some size to it. You want the bluers closer in to your wherever you're going to view your landscape from. And then there's different types of color schemes. So there's monochromatic, which is different shades of the same color. When you use the same color with the different shades, you want to use different sizes and textures of that color. So in this example, of the photos, there's a bunch of different yellows in here that are similar to each other, but there's different sizes and textures to help them stand out, differentiate themselves. Okay, and analogous colors, there are three colors that are next to each other on the color wheel. So if you go back to the color wheel, you want to pull that back up, Chris? Where do I have that? I'm having trouble finding it here. I'll get to it here in a second. Anyway, so if you look at the color wheel, these are three colors that are close to each other. So see, you've got the blue and then some blue violet and red violet. So in this picture, you've got, analogous colors. There are three colors that are pretty close to each other on the color wheel. Okay. And then complementary colors. These are colors that are opposite on the color wheel. So red is opposite from green, orange is opposite from blue, yellow is opposite from violet. So these are two photos or examples of complementary colors where you've got the yellow and the blue, and you've got the orange and the purple. So if you look at the color wheel, they're opposite of each other. Okay? Okay. And so polychromatic colors are a mix of various colors, and then it says rainbow puke underneath there. So I did a job a long time ago. The guy's wife had cancer. She was going to pass away, and it was a spring, and he wanted to just totally color up the yard for her. So we planted all kinds of annuals, all different colors. And the son came home to visit his mom, and she said, "Well, what do you think of the landscape? You like the way it looks?" And he said, "It looks like rainbow puke." So that's always kind of stuck with me, but that's my description of when you're talking about polychromatic colors. Another thing when you're thinking about color, always consider the background colors, the colors in the background. So whatever you put in front of it, whatever kind of plantings, you want to make sure it doesn't clash with those colors. So, that color of the house, the color of a fence or a wall, or a color of plant foliage back behind it, that should be a consideration. Also consider like a hedge, a green hedge or something. That makes an excellent background for most any color. It helps those colors stand out with a nice green background. So here's just some information about the different colors and what they do. So red adds excitement. Too much red can be overwhelming. Red helps bring other colors to life. Blue does not stand out. To help it stand out, you need to add white or pink. Yellow is cheerful. It works well with white, pale blue, red, and brown. And white is kind of peaceful, purity, and it reflects the most light. So if you have somebody who wants a moonlight garden, then you're going to use whites and light grays and stuff like that. So the pictures below kind of show how white or silver kind of helps accentuate the colors around it. Okay, so enough for color. So we're on to design tools. Okay, so the first design tool is bridging, an implied or physical connection between two elements that creates continuity by tying them together. A good example of that, if you went to where we were talking about color, and so back under color, there was where we talked about tying the medium green to the light green, and then there was kind of a row of plants between the two. That would be an example of bridging. That makes sense? Okay, so see that not only did the color bridge those two plantings together, but the shape of the plant grouping tied those two together. So that's called bridging. Tension point, a circulation point which scale is constricted in order to excite curiosity and emphasize sequential experience. So a good example of a tension point would be like a gate. So a lot of times, you know, on the side of your yard, you have a gate that you get into that allows you access to the backyard. So that's a tension point. So you've got a fence on either side, and then you got an open space between them. That creates a tension point. You can do that with plantings. I'll have to maybe draw something to put in there to give a better example of a tension point. A pivot point, an object or element that stands alone or is accentuated sufficiently to create a visual hinge within the composition of a design. A pivot point should be emphasized to reflect its importance in the composition. Usually a tension point is if you're planting, they've got a shrub bed on the corner of a house, okay, and you've got a lawn that goes kind of around that shrub bed. Sometimes you extend that planting bed out into the lawn, and you may put like a columnar plant or something like that that causes the pivot. So is when you're going around the house or around that way, you're pivoting around into the backyard. So that's a pivot point. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense.
Okay. And again, as I'm talking through this, I'll try to make a point of giving some examples of that. The next one, there's enough examples. I think it'll make a lot of sense. So enfrainment, the use of mass and line to direct the eye to a desired view and present the view in a pleasing way. This can be achieved by blocking certain aspects of the view and leading the eye with the use of lines in order to draw attention to a particular view. Mass, line, form, color, and texture can be utilized to enhance and frame the view. So you've got I'm assuming that's a church off into the distance. You're using plant material to frame the view. So you've got trees on your right and some other trees on your left, and an open space between the two to direct your eye to look out into that direction. Make sense? Okay. And a desert scene here where you've used two trees to frame the view. Always keep that in mind if you're, working on a place where there's they've got a view of something. Also, more often than enough, we're trying to block unsightly views from the neighbors and things like that. So if there's a view or an open space that's not as it's more desirable, and you've got these other things that aren't as desirable, so you want to frame that view to direct your eye to look at that way, in that direction, and not notice the other things, the buildings, or the second story deck on the other side, or somebody's unsightly detached garage or something like that. So you redirect the eye from looking at that by using enfrainment, and also by creating a focal point. And we'll get into focal point here in a bit. Okay? Okay. Yeah? What's that?
I said this is all good stuff.
Okay, so proportion, the actual size of the object relative to another object, it creates a sense of scale by the proper sizing of all the parts in relation to the size of the whole as viewed by man. Proportion exists the moment two objects are placed together. The fact that often no effort is made to coordinate the scale of a site, buildings, roads, and miscellaneous elements is one of the primary sources of chaos in our environment. So you have several line drawings here. One is proportionate to the left, and the one on the right is disproportionate. The one showing the house, this is a little bit more, you're just realizing, so you've got a lot of mass in the size of the house, but you need some trees that are maybe a little bigger than that to kind of help tie things together. Or in the other one, the trees are too big and the house is too small. That makes sense?
Yep.
Okay. This is a story I always kind of like to use, and I wish I had a video clip of this. And for example, I'm kind of having a brain fade here, but there was a mockumentary on a rock group. It was a movie, and one of the scenes in the movie, they've had this big concert, and they're in a diner afterwards and talking about their next tour and what they wanted for a set, and they were meeting with the set designer around this table, and they wanted a Stonehenge scene, kind of a Stonehenge set. So they draw it out on a napkin the way they want it, and the kind of what they're looking for. And then so the next scene says it's the opening for the next concert, and they have kind of a dramatic guitar solo leading up to the set coming down from the ceiling. And so down comes this set, and it's the same size of what they drew on the napkin. So, I don't know. I lost you there. I know I did. It was pretty funny. So, imagine this rock group. They're bringing down, they're kind of leading up, their music's leading up to this, and down comes this little Stonehenge that's like 3 inches tall from the ceiling. Okay. Juxtaposition. The placement of design elements of different nature to emphasize their contrast qualities. Juxtaposition introduces irony into a composition. So, an example of juxtaposition is something that's just, so say you have a real formal landscape, everything's asymmetrical and ties together, and then you have a planting or something that is not symmetrical. So it clashes with the rest of the landscape, but if it's done right, it looks really nice, and it really creates a kind of a strong focal point. And I think I've got some photos of that here in a little bit. We'll go through that later. But something that's just like, another example is maybe you have an arborvitae hedge and the person's an artist and they've got some kind of neon sign in front of the, some kind of neon lettering in front of the hedge. So you have two different completely design elements that are tied together, but it makes a pretty good statement. Okay, repetition. And this is something you really want to try to use in your landscape to make sure that everything's cohesive and tied together. So repetition is the placement of the same or similar design element over and over again. It results from placing like things together, enabling the mind to comprehend the composition. It can create monotony or stimulate the viewer. Repeating a plant can create architectural walls and hallways or floors. Repeating a line creates movement. Repeating color makes a small space appear larger. Repetition must be proportional to keep the rhythm moving and yet not allow it to get lost or dissipate. In planting design, repetition can be achieved by placing individual plants in groups or mass of a single species. These masses may then be repeated throughout the landscape as necessary. To achieve harmony of line, form, and mass, there must be some repetition at regular intervals to create a rhythm in the landscape. So there's two things I want to just highlight in this is too many times when you're designing a landscape, there's too many design elements. There's too many varieties of plants. And so the eye really doesn't have a sense of, it doesn't know which way to go. You know, I call it the arboretum look. A lot of times you get an avid gardener that every time they go to the nursery, they buy a different type of plant and they plant it in their yard. And as a result, there's no cohesiveness in their yard. So you know, kind of the ideal landscape design is only going to use 4 or 5, 6, possibly 7 different varieties of plants. And you always want to plant them in mass so that they make an impact. Otherwise, if you have one here, one there, they all kind of blend together and get lost. So that's where you want to use repetition to kind of tie everything together and make things a little bit more cohesive. Okay, point of view, the point from which a composition is perceived. The composition may be interpreted from a worm's eye view to a bird's eye view, depending on the subject's physical location. So this is real important, especially up here in Oregon, where we spend so much more time inside. When you're designing the landscape, you want to know where the viewer is going to view it from. Obviously, the patio makes sense. You know, they're going to view it from there. But if there's a kitchen window or if there's a dining room window that looks out onto the landscape or the backyard, you want to keep that in mind when you're designing the landscape. You don't want to have a focal point and then you can't view it until you go outside or something like that, because people want to enjoy their landscape year-round, even when the weather's not so nice. So that's point of view is very important. Also, you know, if there's a second-story window or something like that, you need to kind of think about that. Maybe that's maybe that's the primary viewing area. Maybe they have a deck coming off the second story, and that's where we're going to be looking at the landscape. Keep that in mind when you're designing the landscape. Okay, baffle, a side plane partially to fully restricting horizontal movement, but allowing vision to pass through, about control the viewers through space by creating a sense of mystery. Okay, so a baffle is kind of like a hedge, but you can see through it. Okay, I've got an example of some grasses here. A lot of times they use a kind of a columnar grass called Carl Forster. It creates kind of a hedge or a screen, but it's something you can kind of see through. So you can use that hedge to direct the eye towards a certain, like if you had a focal point in the corner and you planted the baffle on either side of it, that it can kind of frames that and also kind of point your eye towards that corner. As far as the sense of mystery, maybe someone wanted to kind of create their own little secret garden, and they wanted a sitting area that wasn't really viewed from, kind of separate from the rest of the landscape, but yet they didn't want a hedge around it, so it created just this really tight and closed space. So you would use a baffle to kind of screen it from the rest of the landscape, but the sense of mystery is your eyes are kind of drawn to that, and you're wondering what's back behind the baffle. Follow me?
Yeah,
okay. I'm not putting you to sleep, am I?
No, that's good.
Okay. So movement, the application of motion into a composition to create elements of interest. Movement can be real or implied. Grasses are a great element to create the sense of movement. Also water, a water feature or something that creates a sense of movement. If you have wind chimes or something that moves with the wind, that's another way to create the sense of movement in a landscape. Okay, balance. So here's some line drawings that are pretty good that kind of give you examples of balance. Balance is the equal distribution of mass along a real or imaginary axis. Balance equalizes or adjusts competing forces to obtain stability or repose. Example, a single plant in a plane is a focus. Two similar plants in a plane divide interest equally and create balance. In planting designs, balance reinforces an axis, emphasizes circulation, and accents points of transition. So balance, this first line drawing, balance is achieved when mass and arrangement on each side are visually balanced. The weight of the mass on the left is balanced with the attraction of the tree and the large shrubs on the right. Okay? So that first is balanced. Okay? The second one, the pyramidal evergreen at left overwhelms the balance of the shrub border because its size and placement. So the next line drawing with that pyramidal plant is not balanced. And the next line drawing, another example of something that's balanced, the pyramidal evergreen, and this identical shrub border is in scale with the overall planting, and its placement creates a balanced composition.
So the middle one's not balanced because of that giant tree.
Right.
Right there in the middle.
Right. Uh-huh. Yeah.
Now, okay, so the top one, you have a bigger tree on the right side, and you have kind of smaller trees on the left side. Why is that one balanced?
Well, because of the overall size of the two. So if you add the on the right hand side, if you add the size of the tree and the size of the large shrub next to it, it equals the size of the other plants combined.
Okay.
You see what I'm saying?
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. So contrast, and this is a good design element to use, especially a lot of these little landscapes are they got a 6-foot high cedar fence around them. And so you need the contrast with the fence to kind of soften it. So contrast is the use of strikingly different elements in a setting that serves to accentuate that element. Of two contrasting elements, one must dominate. One is the feature, the other is the supporting and contributing to the backdrop. Otherwise, the two contrasting elements of equal power, visual tensions are generated that weaken or destroy rather than heighten the pleasurable impact of the viewing experience. So, you've got the line drawings across the top where you have a fence, and then you also have just a row of shrubs. So that would be what they call one is the feature and the other is the supporting. So the fence and the row of shrubs is the feature, and then you're planting plants that are going to accentuate that feature. So you have that grouping of plants in front of the fence to kind of accentuate it. You've got that tree in front of that row of shrubs that kind of accentuate that the feature. Got that? Yep. Okay. Emphasis, the differentiation of the more important from the less important. It is created by increasing the dominance of certain elements and the subordination of minor elements. It can be used to differentiate between public and private space. Emphasis is kind of similar to creating a strong focal point. So if you want to separate two different spaces, say you have a public space and you have a private space, public space is going to be more open. The private space may have like a emphasis, like something like a patio or pavers or something like that, or a bench or things like that that make that feel more of a private space. I know that's a little vague, but that's kind of, it's not, emphasis isn't really one of your primary design principles. Okay, focal point, if anything you take away from what you're trying to do here as far as learning landscape design, focal point's one of those primary things that you need to be able to create and understand the use of it in a landscape design. Focal point is a point which the eye is drawn. This can be achieved simply through the use of line, color, texture, or form. However, scale, proportion, emphasis, and contrast may be important components to creating a focal point. As with contrast, it is important that the focal element is dominant and the other elements serve to support or accentuate rather than compete. So this next line drawing is, see how the plants are spaced accordingly to create the focal point, which is the front entrance of the house. Okay. How are we doing on time, Chris?
So it's we're about 15 minutes in right now.
Did you say?
How much more do you think you got left?
What I've got quite a bit left, but you said you had a meeting at 11:30.
I have a meeting at 11:30, but you can keep. You know, most important is to get all this on recorded and everything. And then,
okay. I think probably what makes sense is let's finish this focal point, and we'll stop. Okay. We'll stop there. Okay. Okay. So if you look at the next design, and this is going to be kind of more typical of what we're trying to do here is create a focal point in a backyard. Okay. Typically, depending on where your point of reference is, it's going to be in a corner. Most of these landscapes, we're trying to make the space feel bigger. So if your focal point is kind of diagonal, that's going to be the farthest distance that you're going to be able to look in your landscape. And so as you can see here, they created kind of a strong focal point in the corner. They've used some flowers to add some color. They've used a sculpture to kind of draw the eye into that corner. So usually you're going to have kind of a strong kind of a visual element in the corner. I like to use benches. Benches is a good way to do it, or a bird bath is another strong design element to create a focal point. Also, you're going to use what we call specimen plants, specimen trees, maybe a really nice Japanese maple or a really nice conifer or some type of plant that's usually specimen plants are expensive. So more expensive plants you're going to use in that corner to draw your eye to create a focal point there. You can also use the height of plants, like, so there were several examples like the one we saw before where they started with higher plants and went lower and created the focal point there. The other example of a focal point was where you were using the coarser textured plants closer, and then the medium plants and the finer textured plants. It kind of draws your eye to that direction. So that's going to kind of create kind of a focal point too. So again, you need to kind of have some tools of the trade that you like to use. They're not too expensive to create a focal point, especially in these smaller, tighter backyards where you're going to kind of draw your eye to that area to make the area feel bigger, or if there's unsightly views on either side of the landscape, then you draw your eye to that so that when you step out of the yard, your eye is immediately drawn to this focal point, so that everything else kind of fades into the background. Because you're not always going to be able to buy 30-foot trees to screen out the neighbor's yard, or their unsightly detached garage, or the person that has the ugly fence on the one side or whatever, or the ugly colored house. So it's the focal point that really helps distract from those other things and just help the person appreciate their landscape. Okay. So with that, we'll stop right there, and then we'll continue on. I'm assuming next week or whenever we do.
Yeah, next week will work. Okay, so I'm going